keep seeing articles and influence and that going on about England paying reparations for the slave trade. I'm thinking, well, I've never had a slave, and none of my family or going down the line has ever had a slave. So why should I be paying reparations? And I think they're talking trillions of dollars. It'll put the country in debt, it'll put us in debt, who never owned a slave. Now, apparently these reparations are for our role in the transatlantic slave trade. And this is following, in 2026 this year, UN-backed resolution declaring it's a crime against humanity. Campaigners demand trillions in compensation. And the UN General Assembly recognised the transatlantic slave trade as the greatest crime against humanity. Well, they conveniently overlook the broader history of the practice. They forgot their own history. And wasn't it the English who banned slavery? Just in case I got it wrong, I've done a lot of research. And it seems slavery was widespread in early medieval Europe following the fall of Rome. It gradually declined into serfdom, which is economic slavery. This became the dominant economic system. Of course, not forgetting what the Muslim North Africans were guilty of, but I'll get back to that. Yeah, Britain's involvement in the slave trade at a certain point is one of our proudest accomplishments in English history. I'll explain. The word slave comes from a medieval Latin word which was used to describe the Slavic people from Central and Eastern Europe who were captured and forced into servitude during the late 5th century and the 10th century, 500 years. And around 1600, a Dutch visitor to Benin City in West Africa discovered that there were already thriving slave traditions in Africa. And so they bought slaves from African rulers and traders. The vast majority of slaves taken to Africa were sold by African rulers, traders and military aristocracy, who grew wealthy from the business. Now this was a standard for almost every civilization all across the world. For example, in ancient Greece, Strabo tells us that the island of Dos trafficked in 10,000 slaves a day. Even if that's exaggerated, it's a bloody lot. And the end of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC, it's estimated that a third of Italy was made up of slaves. I mentioned serfdom, so let me explain. Slavery and serfdom are both forced labour systems. They're very different fundamentally in the legal status. The difference to me is that serfdom is given the appearance of being free. Yeah, Britain's involvement in the slave trade at a certain point is one of our proudest accomplishments. Some of these money grabbers argue that slavery and colonialism created the economic foundation for Britain's development. It fired the Industrial Revolution, some say, which may be partly true. But remember, it was England who abolished slavery, not Europe, not North Africa or America. It was Britain. And some politicians have proposed denying visits or visas to citizens from countries that actively pursue reparations against Britain. Good on them. Yeah, and incidentally, when Britain abolished slavery in 1833, the government paid 20 million in compensation. It was a massive sum at the time. This was compensation to slave owners, not the enslaved, for their loss of property. But this massive payment more than helped stop the backlash to its abolishment. And the government only finished paying off the loans taken to compensate the slave owners in 2015. Now they want us to go into debt for trillions more pounds. Now yes, obviously slavery was horrible, aberrant, it was cruel and vile. And if there were slaves alive today, they would absolutely be deserving of reparations. Of course they would. But there are no victims of British Empire slaves alive today. I mean, look at it this way. If say my family were murdered by the Nazis or murdered by the communists and they were sent to the gulags by Stalin in Siberia, they'd be entitled to reparations because it was in their lifetime. Like Germany paying reparations and the Japanese paying reparations for their atrocities, because this was in living memory and that was fine. But the idea that it's someone else's fault, that I am the dilemma, and if you really want to improve your lot in life, you need to stop looking for others to blame and look within your own community to see why. Why is it only the English people who have to pay this? Out of a population of millions, there are only a handful of slave owners. The vast majority of people in this country descended from people who live lives akin to serfdom, who are not much better off than slaves themselves. And there are many more non-white people who are equally complicit in committing just as bad atrocities. I think essentially slaves have been used as a weapon, a stick to beat us with, Britain and America. To tap the West more broadly, it's a cash grab. And apparently there are more slaves held in bondage in Africa today than were ever transported across the Atlantic. I think it was CNN reported in 2017 that there are hundreds of slaves sold every week in Libyan slave markets. The Arab slave trade carries on. And apparently there are still slave ships going from Africa to the Middle East carrying slaves today. Why do the race activists never talk about that? It was only a couple of decades ago a ship was shipwrecked, and when they were rescued they found that all the young children on board were African children that had been kidnapped and sold into slavery and were being shipped to the Middle East. They were returned to the families only to be sold again into slavery later on. And I think the fact that no one talks about this on the left, none of the reparationists will discuss this, speaks volumes, because surely the plight of these people should be more important as they are alive today in slavery, not 200 years ago. That's 18 generations back. But like I say, it was Britain who actually abolished slavery throughout most of the empire via the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. And the movement was led by figures like William Wilberforce, who was a British politician from Yorkshire. And after the abolition of slavery, the Royal Navy patrolled the coast for over 60 years, seizing approximately 1,600 slave ships and freeing 150,000 people. And we used its diplomatic and naval powers to pressure other nations to sign anti-slavery treaties. Right, going back to the Barbary coast and the African slave trade, it was well established long before Europeans arrived on the scene and was driven by demands for more labour. Now, these Barbary pirates, or corsairs, were Muslim raiders and slavers operating from North Africa's Barbary coast from the 16th to the 19th centuries, and many of them were based in the Algiers. They attacked Mediterranean shipping and coastal European villages, capturing estimated over 1 million people for the slave trade, sometimes raiding as far north as Iceland. And castration was one of the often brutal practices used on male slaves within the slave system. It was not necessarily applied to every single male captive, but castrated men were deemed more reliable, less rebellious, and allowed owners to avoid the complication of caring for slaves' offspring. And castrated slave boys or eunuchs were often the most expensive on the market. And they say the Muslim castration process was brutal and performed without modern medicines, obviously. And it's estimated that a very high percentage, sometimes reported as 6 out of 10, died from the procedure. And the female captives of the Barbary pirates were forced into harsh treatment as well, with many being forced into domestic servitude or concubines and prostitution. While they were spared the typical brutal, heavy physical labour enforced on men, they faced constant threats of rape, conversion to Muslim under duress, and torture. And the majority of the young white girls captured by the Barbary slaves faced sexual exploitation, and they were expected to have children as soon as they became a woman. Some of them had children at the age of 12 and 13 years old. That still goes on today. Now, I'm not saying same thing didn't go on with the European slaves, the English and the American plantation slavery. It probably did. Now, of particular interest is that they raided the UK coastal villages and shipping, enslaving thousands of Britons in Cornwall and Dorset. They were the hardest hit, with sailors and villagers kidnapped for sale in North Africa's slave markets. And in August 1623, Corsairs raided Mount Bay in Cornwall, capturing 60 men, women and children, taking them to slavery. And then again in 1626, St Kevin was reportedly attacked, and boats out of many Cornish ports were boarded, the crews taken and captured, and the empty ships left adrift. It was thought that there were around 600 Barbary men of war prowling the Devon and Cornish coast, and attacks were occurring almost daily. The situation got so bad in 1640, a committee for Algiers was set up by Parliament to oversee the ransoming back of captives. And it's thought at this time it was reported that there was some 3,000 to 5,000 English people in captivity in Algiers taken from the coast. And charities were also set up to help ransom the captives. Local fishing communities clubbed together to raise money to liberate their own. And in 1645, it was really bad. A big raid by Barbary pirates on the Cornish coast saw 240 men, women and children kidnapped in one go. And the following year, Parliament sent Edmund Gayson, to Algiers to negotiate the ransom and release of many of the English captives. He paid on average £30 per man. Women were more expensive to ransom, and he managed to free some 250 people before he ran out of money. He spent the last 8 years of his life trying to arrange the release of a further 400. So I think Edmund Carson is a name to remember. By the 1650s, the attacks were so frequent that they threatened England's fishing industry. Obviously, the fishermen were reluctant to put to sea and leaving their families unprotected ashore. Should they be claimed for reparations? Their ancestors? Just a thought. It actually took someone like Oliver Cromwell to take action, and he decided or decreed that any captured corsairs should be taken to Bristol and slowly drowned. And Lundy Island, where pirates from the Republic of Sale, now Morocco, had made their base, were attacked and bombarded. But despite this, the corsairs continued and mounted raids on the Cornwall, Devon and Dorset coast. So something serious had to be done. And in 1675, Sir John Narborough, backed by the Royal Navy Squadron, managed to negotiate a peace with Tunis. And a heavy naval bombardment by the British then brought about the similar peace with Tripoli. See, if you push the English too hard, you'll be in trouble, eh? Drastic measures taken. The Algiers was also attacked from the sea, not only by the British warships, but also by the French and Spanish. And later, the United States fought 2 wars against the Barbary states of North Africa. The first was in 1801-1805, and the second in 1815. And finally, after an attack by the British and Dutch in 1816, more than 4,000 Christian slaves were liberated, and the power of the Barbary pirates was broken. So can we learn some lessons from this? And if you're one of these people shouting for reparations, think about it, think on. If you're a money-grabbing git,